As Raina mentioned, I'm now part of Intel, so I have to show this disclaimer really quickly. The gist of it is that whatever I tell you here is my opinion, so don't cite Intel for that. And I would like to start with the history of neuromorphic computing and kind of place it a little bit in the history of artificial intelligence as we have it today. And by artificial intelligence, I mean very, very broadly, just smart technical things, smart computers. And I will simplify that history and just look at the two kind of strands, two threads that go through the history of artificial intelligence. One is the symbolic AI thread, and another one is connectionist thread. So in symbolic AI, people started with trying to understand and model in computers the way how people think, how people solve problems, how people speak. So all the high level cognitive functions of people. And a lot of that is about manipulating symbols, right? Representing symbols, the cup, the cup, a table, cup is on the table, relations between symbols, and trying to build logical models like that. And that, of course, has been driving a lot of the computing as we know it today, as I'll show you in a second. And the second strand is connectionism. So that's an idea that we can try to understand how people speak and do logic and do math by looking at the computing substrate with which people do that. So neuronal networks in the brain. So let's try a more bottom-up approach and start with modeling those networks of which we know more and more. Well, we are in 1950s here in the beginning. And then when we have large enough networks, then we maybe can then start thinking and start seeing how all these higher level symbolic cognitive functions emerge. Now, these two strands had their bumpy histories, as most of you might know. If you don't know, it might be worth looking up. It's really interesting. So they had their winters and then really enthusiastic periods when a lot was promised, and then this promise was not really achieved. So we still, until today, don't have really human-like artificial intelligence systems. Like in many aspects, maybe in single aspects. But they were developing using the very rushed development of computing hardware. And now, of course, being at Intel, I can appreciate this rush history of computing hardware that started with the concept of a Turing machine. So this idea that you can build a machine, a very simple principle that you have a memory. Now, in a Turing machine, that would be a tape, and you have some mechanism that can read and write to and from this memory. And Turing has proven that by this machine, you can compute a lot of stuff. You can compute anything computable. And this powerful idea drives our computers until today. So if you take any computer out there, the one in your cell phone, the one in your desktop computer, or in the large server farm, it always the same principle. You have memory. Now you have some long-term memory, like your computer drive, memory drive, and you have short-term memory, and then you have an arithmetic computing unit, a CPU, that goes back and forth to this memory, grabs little symbols, manipulates them, writes them back. And in the history of computing, these computations just became faster and faster. That today we can do billions of operations like that per second in tiny, tiny chips. So this is what has driven progress in both connectionism, so how well can we run those neuronal networks and how good can they work, and symbolic AI, so how large our software systems that just implement some rules can become. So that today, both of them led, on the one hand side, to all the wealth of software, database analysis, your favorite word editor, your favorite computer game. Behind that are the algorithms that are based on this development and thinking of the logic. How can we express different operations, different logic, different mathematical functions in the way so that computer can run them. All the data structure, graph-based computing, parallel computing, your favorite OpenCV pipeline that processes images in an old-fashioned, like not deep learning way. Statistics, all the science computing, all the base of knowledge that we have today, it's basically byproduct of this attempt to build more and more complex artificial intelligence systems driven by developing computing hardware. And the deep learning is another success story. So connectionists, they were struggling to make these neuronal networks do something useful. But then as it scaled up and as we learned to build large systems and to train large systems, we have the deep learning based AI today that has state-of-the-art performance in so many tasks, starting from image processing and object recognition classification to sound processing. Many of you might have the Siri or Alexa at home. Quite amazing things that have been achieved there. So where is the place of neuromorphic computing here? And I won't go into detail why we need neuromorphic computing at all. Maybe I'll touch upon that at the very end. So now just descriptively telling you the story. So neuromorphic computing appeared somewhat independent of these two strands around late 1980s um, in Caltech, in the lab of cover meat. In Caltech, they in the 80s, they had this experiment where they were mixing different disciplines. So there were biologists who would study neuroscience, neurobiologists, and they would be put in the same room with electrical engineers one day. And biologists would speak about those models of neurons, how neurons process information, integrating currents on their membrane, and then the voltage will go up, will reach a threshold, and then they communicate with spikes, so with brief pulses of voltage. And electrical engineers will say, oh, that's very interesting. We can actually build circuits that will do something like that. So we can have artificial neuron built very easily in silicon, in hardware. And people found it fascinating, and they started building these circuits, larger and larger circuits that behave like biological neurons. You can connect them like biological neurons with synapses. You can make the synapses have some properties that are similar to biological neurons, and you can start building larger and larger pieces of artificial brain. And this is what gave rise to the field of neuromorphic hardware that now celebrates its 30th birthday, you could say. And because this type of hardware is so different from this original idea of the Turing machine and the von Neumann computing architecture, with the memory sitting in one place and the, your CPU sitting in another place, the computing unit, it was a completely different computing architecture. So we need to develop new programming languages and algorithms and analyze the algorithms, how well they run on this type of hardware. And this is what drives the field of neuromorphic computing, that kind of rethinks the computing, not for the conventional computing architecture, but for this new different computing architecture. And today, so from 1990s to 2021, there are a number of systems that have been developed. So here I just show pictures of some of them. The early systems, they used analog electronics to build the dynamics of biological neurons. And then I'll show you in a second the dynamics. Those of you who are familiar with analog electronics, they will see that all those exponential temporal characteristics, they are pretty easy to get if you use an analog, the transistors in an analog regime, in a subthreshold regime. You have this exponential temporal characteristics kind of for free, just with a couple transistors. But there are some limitations. If you use analog electronics, you cannot build very large systems. Wiring becomes a problem, and you get some problems with noise and the mismatch. The systems are very sensitive. They use very small currents, and your transistors, they are not driven to 0 or 1, where they can operate robustly. But you read out the exact kind of voltage characteristics of these transistors, and this is of course noisy and sensitive. So when the companies got interested in this technology, they started building digital neuromorphic hardware, meaning they use conventional digital technology, but the structure of the processor is different, isn't optimized for running these spiky neural networks on chip. So today, if you look in the literature, you'll see a whole zoo of different neuromorphic chips and neuromorphic hardware. There are different designs that have been proposed by academic labs, by industry, such as us at Intel or IBM or Qualcomm had its take on neuromorphic hardware, and many startups who also offer neuromorphic chips for solving different tasks. Different technologies being used, either conventional digital CMOS or mixed signals, so analog and digital, or using new materials. So there have been some new materials discovered that potentially could replace transistors and other elements in this technology, so-called memristors, for instance, materials that can keep memory, and that's of course could be useful for some elements in these neuronal networks. So if we now want to look what is inside, what defines neuromorphic hardware, how do you differentiate it for some other accelerator built for neuronal networks, for instance, for deep neuronal networks, then I usually highlight 3 kind of core characteristics of neuromorphic hardware today. And why today? Because tomorrow we might see it a little bit more generally, and then maybe we'll touch upon that at the end. So first, if we want to draw distinction between neuromorphic hardware and your favorite neural network accelerator, like a tensor processing unit, and the first distinctive feature is the neuronal model that is implemented here. And the neuronal model is slightly closer to the neurons in the brain than deep learning, like neuronal model that is used in deep learning architectures. So deep learning, as you have a value, and then you have some output threshold function. It could be a ReLU, it could be some sigmoid function. In neuromorphic hardware, typically we implement spiky neurons that follow leaky, integrate, and fire model of spiky neurons. It's a very simple model. So what it does, the neuron receives inputs, and I'll talk about the nature of these inputs in a second, integrates them over time, so like neurons, artificial neurons usually do, then overlays this integrated value with temporally decaying function. So this value is integrated and it just kept around over time. And it might decay over time, for instance. So there's some persistent state of the neuron. And if the neuron has integrated enough inputs so that it reaches an activation threshold, then the neuron emits a spike. And a spike in this implementation is just a digital event. So it's either there or not. It's just a binary event that is sent when the neuron's internal variable crosses the threshold. So instead of sending its internal value, with some fixed timing, with some fixed clock to the downstream neurons, the neuron sends events when the internal variable crosses the threshold. If internal variable never crosses the threshold, the neuron never communicates its internal variable to another neuron. If it crosses the threshold a lot, then there will be a lot of spikes that are being sent. Now, these spikes, they come on the other side to the downstream neuron, and they arrive at the synapse of the neuron. And the synapse, again, does some temporal filtering of the synapse. So it convolves this binary event with some temporal filter that sometimes can be learned. So this is one of the parameters of the synapse. So synapse now not only has the weight so that it can make the signal stronger or weaker that arrives, but it can also have different temporal filtering of the signal. So if we now compare this neuronal model to a more simple deep learning neuronal model, we see that time is explicitly included in computation here. So the neurons are now not just numbers that just sit there in memory and they change, when input comes and at a certain time clock they are read out. Here, neuron has some internal temporal dynamics. And time plays an important role because the time when the spike has been emitted plays role in computation, and at what times the input times come also plays role in the computation, because remember, internal variable develops over time. When spike arrives slightly later, it will reach other value of the internal variable. So time is now first-class citizen in this computing system. The second event of spike transmit activation, and this is thought to be the key reason why neuromorphic hardware is energy efficient. And I will show at the end some benchmarking that shows how much energy efficiency you can gain from this type of computing, even when using digital technology, so not going into some exotic low power analog or memory stiff devices. And finally, now our signals are not represented with values or with matrices of values or tensors of values as is done in deep learning, but with special temporal patterns of spikes. So the spikes, as they arrive as discrete events in time and in space, this is what defines your signal. This, of course, becomes a challenge computationally because we have a whole history of understanding how to work with matrices of values, like images, but we don't have a similar history of dealing with especially temporal patterns. So many algorithms we have to rethink and reinvent for this type of information representation. So the second distinctive characteristics of neuromorphic hardware is the network topology that we can create. In deep learning, people have converged on a couple topologies that everyone uses, and those are either just layered structures, feed-forward structures. You get an image as an input, and then it goes over a number of layers. They are all feed-forward, all-to-all connected layers with trained weights, and then you have an output. Or you have a convolutional network. Same story, but now you have some convolutions in your connections going forward. However, the overall space of possible network topologies for neural networks is much, much larger. You could imagine all kind of networks. You can imagine some little circuits that maybe create little oscillations here and there. You can imagine some modules that, as Rainer said in his talk, maybe solve some perceptual tasks here and some motor tasks here. And then maybe in between you have a couple possible modules that you can switch on and off. So you can imagine some small world topology where you have densely interconnected modules, recurrently interconnected modules that are loosely connected to some other modules. So neuromorphic hardware gives you a possibility to explore this space of neuronal algorithms that you could use to design your system. And it could include learning or not. It could also have a lot of design component. So this is kind of the second distinctive characteristics of this hardware. And finally, learning is, of course, important keyword when we're talking about neuronal networks, because the reason to use neuronal network is typically that we don't have to program whatever we want to do, but we can just let the system learn it. So the learning that is implemented in neuromorphic hardware follows biological blueprint. And in biology, we don't directly see backpropagation. It's not quite clear how biological neurons would implement something like backprop, compute all those errors and then propagate the gradient backwards. There are some models that show how maybe something similar could have been done. But what we obviously see in biology is synaptic plasticity of a Hebbian type, meaning that the synapse that changes, that is plastic, is only informed about a state of the pre and postsynaptic neuron and nothing else in the system. So it doesn't know the value of other synapses, so it cannot normalize itself based on that. It doesn't know activity of some other neuron somewhere else. So what we observe in biology is that the synapse can change if the spikes arrive in certain order on the pre and postsynaptic neuron. The classical learning rule is spike time dependent plasticity, STDP. So when the pre is first and the post is second, then the synapse will get stronger. And when the post is first and the pre is second, then the synapse will get weaker, which is of course fascinating because the synapse seems to detect some kind of causality. If the causality is right, then it grows, and if the causality is wrong, then it goes down. In biology, it's not the only learning rule that people observe. People observe the opposite. People observe synapses that don't care about the order of spikes on their ends. They just see that they are in some temporal proximity. There are different types of rules. And then neuromorphic hardware, in particular, in for instance, Intel's neuromorphic chip, the designer has some flexibility and freedom to design the learning rule. But it has to use only activity of the pre and postsynaptic neuron, maybe immediate spikes, maybe some temporally filtered activity. So, the postsynaptic neuron fired and the presynaptic neuron was active 5 time steps ago or some time ago, then go up or down. And it can also learn some third factor. Because, of course, to make learning stable, you might want to switch it off at some point, or you might only switch it on in certain conditions. For instance, if you get a reward or punishment and you don't learn otherwise. So this third factor helps that. But no, your learning rule has to be local. So these are the 3 distinctive characteristics of neuromorphic hardware. Now, the hardware designers, they can do the magic and put these type of computing elements into hardware and run it really, really efficiently. So Intel's neuromorphic chip is one example of that hardware. And I'll talk a little bit more about that just to make it more concrete. So in Intel's chip, we have 128 neuromorphic cores. Each of them supports around 1,000 spiky neurons. So we have 128,000 spiky neurons on the chip. With 120 million synapses on this chip. So you can see it's not quite enough to have all-to-all densely connected networks. So you have to think about network topologies and ideally come up with some sparse or local network topologies to not run out of synapses. Has advanced spiky neuronal network feature set. It means that now it has this spiky leaky integrated fine neuron with some parameters. You can select some temporal characteristics of these neurons, their thresholds. So you have some freedom to parameterize neurons and synapses. Supports highly complex neural network topologies. So as I said, you can connect your network in whatever topology you want. Scalable on-chip learning, so it's local learning rules. So you can have every synapse in your network learning. It won't slow you down. It won't cost you much in terms of energy. It's a fully digital implementation, so it doesn't use any exotic devices. Asynchronous, so it means there's no clock that's like according to which all these processes run. It's really asynchronous implementation. That's what's differentiated from conventional computers. This particular chip comes in different form factors. That just to give you a feeling of how much resources are available today. So the smallest form factor is the USB stick that has 2 chips, so it would be 200,000 spiky neurons. And the largest system has 768 chips, so it will be around 100 million neurons. And I can tell you, like next week, more is coming. More of the neurons is coming. So now we have this hardware, and Human Brain Project, of course, can also boast 2 excellent neuromorphic systems, Spinnaker and Brain Scales, and there are other systems. So we have the hardware there that behaves like human brain does. So now the big question, so how do we get from there to the actually behaving systems? How do we wire up all those neurons so that they behave as amazingly as biological brains do? Like you have these tiny brains and they do these amazing maneuvers, finding food, finding the way back to the nest, finding flowers, landing on them so beautifully. How do we do that? So the big question that bothers neuromorphic research community today is algorithms. How do we come up with the algorithms to wire up those systems? And I'll show you a couple approaches to that. The first approach people often take, which might be not the best approach, which I will come back to at the very end of the presentation, is just to use the success of deep learning that we had so far. So there are so many deep neural networks that solve practical tasks that one thing that we could do is just take a trained deep neural network and convert it into spiking domain. just changing, parameter per parameter, you can find an equivalent spiky neural network that will behave just as your trained deep neural network. And people have shown that when you do that, first you can keep the accuracy basically as it was in your original deep neural network. Sometimes there might be some losses. In some cases, it's okay to take those losses. And you might gain in speed of processing in some cases, and you might gain in energy efficiency of your system. Moreover, and this has been shown in this work, that when you put this network, pre-trained network on chip, you can leave some layer of this network plastic, like here to be this readout layer, could be kept plastic so that you can learn new additional things. So in this example, it's about gesture recognition. So there was a network, it was pre-trained to recognize a couple gestures. And the gestures here are recorded with the dynamic vision sensor, also with neuromorphic sensor. It's not so important for my point here. What is important is that, so the last layer, the second to last layer of this network, it holds some nice feature representation for this type of task and gesture recognition, so that you could use this representation and just from it learn additional gestures. So what has been shown by this group of Emre and Nefce is that on the fly you can invent some new gesture and it will be learned, and you can take care so that you don't forget the old gestures, and that you can have some type of continual learning by using these online on-chip learning rules that are implemented on the chip. One little twist here. So here the network was not trained as a conventional artificial deep neural network and then transferred into spiking domain. It was trained directly in spiking domain. And that is also possible, although the output function of a spiking neuron is non-differentiable, strictly speaking. No, it's a delta function, not nice to take derivative of, but you can find some ways around that. So you can replace that output function with some differentiable function, and you can still apply your favorite backpropagation algorithm to train deep spiky neural network. Will take a while, but you will have a network that solves the task. So as I mentioned, it has been shown that when you do that, so when you take some deep learning structure and convert it into spiking domain, you can win in terms of energy consumption, for instance. So here it shows the dynamic energy cost per inference on low-EHI was 100 times less than on GPU, and even 5 times less than on normal videos. This is a neuronal accelerator built for these type of tasks. And also the average inference speed. So as your network gets larger, and here they made it larger in a bit artificial way, but just to make the point, as the network gets larger on low-EHI, your speed stays approximately constant. So it's really massively parallel hardware, while on other accelerators, it does go down. And the average cost per inference, same story. As the network gets larger, we have the same cost per inference, and on conventional hardware, it goes up. And here it's dynamic cost per inference independence of the batch size. And this shows on a limitation of neuromorphic hardware, because neuromorphic hardware is not built to work with this batched data. It's really built to work in the continuous loop when data is streamed, and you have to make the decision on this stream. Because remember, time plays a role here. Time is part of the computation. So it would be artificial for the system to process data in some batches where you get rid of the time, and it's now just the ensemble of things. You can do it, but then you will have less gains in efficiency. So this is one way how you can program a neuromorphic chip. Just take your favorite deep network and you can get an SNN equivalent. It will solve the task. It will run on neuromorphic hardware, probably efficiently. Another way how we can do that, and that is shown here on the right-hand side, is that we can take some circuits, some neuronal circuits that neuroscientists have found fast. So in neuroscience, it's a huge field today, and many people, they look at different intricate circuits here and there, maybe in auditory cortex, maybe in olfactory cortex, for instance, olfactory bulb and subcortical structures. And for instance, for olfaction, people have found a network that seems to solve the odor classification or discrimination task. And people have hypothesized the network that does that. So it includes some complex multi-compartment neurons that have a lot of inputs. People think that the learning rule, like on the synapses that connect these inputs, that modifies both the weight and the delay, is probably responsible for learning patterns that represent different orders. And what one can do is just implement that network known from neuroscience on neuromorphic hardware, and then see how it works. And it has been shown that it can work very well. And in particular, one can show one-shot learning of orders. So the first step, we need to represent order as a vector of spikes. So this spike pattern with different timings of spikes. Then we make the synapses learn this pattern by adjusting the delays and end weights. And when we do that, we can then recognize the learned order even in a mixture with other gases, or in a mixture with some unknown gases. And the recognition rate that we get can go up to 92% after just single presentation of the orders, of a couple orders. If you do the same with the deep learning, that you will need much many samples with different backgrounds in order to train the deep network to solve the same task. So another the way how one can program these networks is just by getting inspired from the nature. And there are many examples of that. So here I only talk about olfaction. You can imagine in the hippocampus, the navigation networks of place cells and grid cells. That's another example where quite fully fledged algorithms have been developed by getting this neuronal inspiration. So the last example that I will show you, and that will maybe touch upon a little bit and show an example of somewhat cognitive architecture that one can build up in this substrate. And this will be about object learning and object recognition, a typical task for deep learning. However, not a quite typical scenario of a robot learning. So I have a robot in my home, let's imagine, and I wanted to differentiate 10 objects that I have in that home. My phone, my favorite cup, my favorite book. It has been shown that it's not the best idea to take the best trained network on ImageNet that can distinguish any car from any cat on this planet, because it probably won't know my particular book and my particular phone. So it will be at the same time an overkill, because I don't care about every car in this world. And it won't differentiate maybe my particular book very well, especially because I can present it from different viewpoints. So this object learning task is somewhat different than the typical object classification task that we know from image processing. So it's a robotic task. So here it's more about learning particular instance of an object, but learning to recognize it from different sides. So what we have shown, and a couple additional details that we used, again, event-based camera for that, but it doesn't matter here that much. So the network that we have developed, it does have some deep learning pre-processing. So we do extract some features, in this case, very, very simple, Gabor just fixed handcrafted features, could be some pre-trained features. And then we leave the last layer, the readout layer of this network, plastic, and we will learn it on chip. And then this plastic layer will go to a group of neurons per object, and we'll maybe have like 10, 15 such groups to learn 10, 15 different objects. And each group of neurons consists of a number of neurons, each responsible for different view of this object. So if I discover that an object that I think I know, but I don't recognize now, so it looks very differently. So maybe it's not worth to update this single layer of synapses to also learn this new view. It's probably better to have another set of synapses that will go to another readout neuron to learn this new pose. So basically, these individual neurons per group represent different poses of this object, different views on this object. And if view is similar enough, then maybe I will update the weights, make them a bit more general. But if it's different, I will just have another object. Now you can see around the system, there are a number of neurons, and there's only a fraction of those are shown here. This is something we call neuronal state machine. So this is a little neuronal machine that ensures that this network can function autonomously on that robot. In order to do that, I need in the system to detect different states in which the system can be. One state, for instance, could be I see an object. So after all my filters and object extraction architecture, I have some activity in this feature layer. I see some object, but no output neuron is active. So I don't recognize this object. So that's a state. I see an object, I don't recognize it. I need to learn it. And this will trigger certain behavior of the robot. Now, it will ask for a label, and then it will listen to the label, and then next state will be evaluated. Do I know this label? Have I heard this label before? If I have, then it must be an object that I already know, but I don't recognize it, so it must look differently now. So maybe I will recruit another pose neuron and just learn this new view of an object. And then later see how I merge them maybe or not. If this object is new, then I will recruit a new group of neurons and learn a new object. If I make a mistake, there will be another state. Now, I made my decision, but the user gave me a different label. Oops, I made a mistake. So again, then I need to go back and update the weights that have led to my, false positive and to false negative, and kind of try to draw them apart. So there's a whole system of little neurons. It's just a handful of neurons in the end, but they are wired to detect these different states that are critical for the learning process and for interaction with the user. Now, for the overall behavior, even that is not the end of the story, because so our robot now observes some tabletop with many objects on it. We want our system to keep small and manageable and kind of agile. So our object recognition system doesn't analyze the whole field of view of the robot. It only analyzes a little part of the field of view in high resolution in the fovea, so somewhere in the center. So we need some system that will make the robot look at all these different objects. And we have a system like that. So we take one of the models of attention, similar to what Rainer has mentioned. So there's a model of attention from IIT, Italian Institute of Technology, the object-centered attention. So what it gives us are candidate for potential objects. And there's some definition of what is an object and what is just some texture on the table. And then I have a mechanism that no, I have a behavior look, so that the robot will look at this object. And when I know the object is in the center, then I will try to recognize it. And then if I fail to recognize it, then I will try to learn it. I will ask the user for the label and will learn it. And then when I've learned it, I will try to recognize it again. If I recognize it, I will move on to the next object. So, on top of the object recognition, I have this attentional module and I have the behaviors. Again, they're represented and controlled by neurons that are active and inactive and control activation and deactivation of different behaviors. On top of that, I have another module that I call SLAM here, simultaneous localization and mapping. And what it does, it basically keeps track of the spatial locations of these objects, where I have seen them before in my scene. And that can help me to interact with the user about the objects. The user tells me, give me the ball. I don't see the ball at the moment, but I know it has been there. I can look back at the ball and check whether it's still there. So all these modules, they're all little neuronal networks with very different structure, but I can put them all on this neuromorphic chip and run them efficiently in the substrate, with all this asynchronous computing. So to finalize, I will show this slide. This is a plot from a recent paper from our group in IEEE proceedings, Mike Davis et al. 2021, where we have summarized the research that has been done in Intel's neuromorphic research community. This is our outreach program to universities and companies, and there are many groups who work on different workloads, different architectures, algorithms with neuromorphic hardware. And what we have done is we have just put all the results in this plot that shows energy ratio. So our neuromorphic chip, so neuromorphic chip versus something else. So versus some other hardware. It could be a CPU or GPU or Movidius neuronal stick. It depends on the shape of the dot here. So how much more efficiently neuromorphic implementation is and how faster it is. So solution time ratio. And you can see there are some workloads that give you 10,000 times more energy efficient solutions, while at the same time being 1,000 times faster than conventional solution. And then there are some other workloads where the gains might be smaller or not at all. Now, if we look at which solutions are in this corner, those would be mostly those deep learning networks. So it seems that this neuromorphic hardware is not well suited for the task for which deep learning networks were developed. And you can imagine how that's the case. So if you have those 100-layer network, this will be a real 100 layers over which the signal will need to go over time in spiky neural network. These networks will be also dense. They will be densely interconnected, and there will be values that need to be sent around from every pixel, from layer to layer. And it will be just many spikes in the systems. So these deep neural networks that do image processing typically won't run efficient and fast and neuromorphic hardware. And the networks that are in this corner, they all have this different structure. Most of them have some recurrent structure, where you have some recurrent loops that could be some controllers for robotic actuators like arms. That could be some sparse coding networks in which you also kind of reverberate activation in some network to get the solution. It could be SLAM networks, simultaneous localization and mapping, or k-nearest neighbor search, these massively parallel but one-shot search networks. So these networks tend to land in this corner where we have these huge gains in terms of energy and power consumption. Okay, so to conclude, we do believe that neuromorphic hardware has a great future in terms of moving our technology forward, computing technology, whether we are talking about sensing, visual sensing or other type of sensors, wind, pressure, force, personalized computing and human robot, human machine interfaces, gesture recognition, gaze recognition and tracking, autonomous mobility, whether it's flying or driving, large scale computing or human computer interfaces or brain computer interfaces. In all these domains, this type of computation and computing hardware could just be very, very advantageous. And the last little advertisement, so we welcome people from all over the world to join our neuromorphic research community ecosystem. Intel drives that, but we just want to neuromorphic computing community to move forward because there's so much work to be done there. The hardware is just the first step. This hardware is so different from conventional hardware that we need to reinvent information theory. We have reinvent algorithms. The analysis of complexity of the algorithms need to be done differently. We need to develop software framework, build systems, and run algorithms, find applications. So we are really happy to count today. Today, it's almost 150 groups all over the world that join our community and just work to move this field forward. Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm over time, but I guess that was the spirit, as York has warned us, and I will be very happy to take some questions. Thank you.